Greta Harris had always believed that a new home could be more than just a place to live. It could be a canvas for transformation. After years of working in a busy, impersonal architectural firm, she finally saved enough to buy an old house in the outskirts of the city. The property, though in dire need of repair, offered something rare in a world of cookie-cutter suburbs: character. The house was a charming relic from the past, with intricate woodwork and spacious rooms that invited creativity. Greta's vision was clear. She would restore the house to its former glory while adding her own modern touch. It was going to be her sanctuary, a place where her love for design could thrive. But it wasn't long before she started noticing something unusual. The neighborhood, though quaint, had a peculiar air of conformity. The homes were meticulously maintained, and there was an almost palpable pressure to adhere to unspoken rules. As a designer, Greta found this sense of order stifling, but she shrugged it off, assuming it was just the nature of suburban life. It wasn't until she discovered the gate that things began to unravel. It wasn't just any gate. It was a high-tech security structure with cameras, sensors, and heavy steel bars that looked completely out of place. And it wasn't even on her property. The gate was on the line between her yard and the one next door, and from what Greta could tell, it wasn't there by accident. Someone had gone to great lengths to install it without her knowledge or consent. When Greta confronted her new neighbors, they acted surprised but not at all concerned. A few whispered apologies, but the situation seemed to be brushed off as something minor. However, Greta's instincts told her that something wasn't right. The more she looked into it, the more questions arose. The gate was branded with a small plaque that read, "Emergency Access." But there was no emergency, no natural disasters, no sudden influx of traffic, no special needs that required a security gate in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It seemed almost as though it was placed there to control something or someone. With a growing sense of unease, Greta took the next logical step. She visited the local homeowners association office to inquire about the gate's legitimacy. The response she received only deepened her concerns. The HOA office confirmed that the gate was indeed authorized, but the explanation was vague at best. They mentioned something about neighborhood security improvements, but refused to provide any concrete details. Greta felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. This was no mere bureaucratic oversight. It was a deliberate move to encroach upon her privacy. She was caught in the web of something larger than she could have ever imagined, and yet there was no clear way forward. The HOA's dismissive attitude, coupled with the unsettling presence of the gate, made it clear that Greta was not dealing with a simple misunderstanding. There was a deeper agenda at play, one that she couldn't yet fathom but was determined to uncover. What started as a simple question about a gate quickly turned into a complex puzzle that involved not only her home, but the very nature of the community she had chosen to live in. The more she dug, the more she began to uncover a system that seemed designed to manipulate, control, and monitor. Greta had never been the type to back down, but the stakes had just been raised higher than she ever could have anticipated. Greta's visit to the Homeowners Association office did nothing to quell her growing suspicions. In fact, it only intensified them. After hearing the vague and evasive answers about the mysterious gate, she returned home, unsettled but determined to dig deeper. She spent the next few days scouring through the official documents that came with the house, looking for any mention of security measures or neighborhood improvements that would justify such an intrusive structure. To her surprise, nothing in the documents indicated any such project, let alone one that involved the installation of a high-tech, imposing gate. It was as though the gate had simply appeared, a hidden agenda planted in plain sight. It made no sense, and yet there it was, looming at the boundary of her property, a constant reminder that something was off. Greta knew she couldn't let it go. She wasn't one to accept things at face value, especially when they threatened her personal space and privacy. So she decided to take a different approach. Instead of continuing to chase down leads through the formal channels, which had already proven fruitless, she began to speak with the neighbors. She had to find out if anyone else had noticed the gate, or if they too were oblivious to the larger forces at play. It didn't take long before she encountered one neighbor in particular, a middle-aged woman named Karen, who seemed more than eager to discuss the gate. Karen was well known in the neighborhood for her gregarious personality and strong opinions, often acting as the self-appointed spokesperson for the community. When Greta approached her about the gate, Karen immediately launched into an explanation that sounded rehearsed. "Oh, it's just a precaution. Karen said with a forced smile. You know, for emergency situations. The neighborhood's been growing, and it's just something the HOA decided to do to keep things safe. I'm sure you understand. Her tone was friendly, but there was an underlying edge of condescension, as though Greta was overreacting to something perfectly normal. The way she said, "I'm sure you understand," made it clear that Karen expected Greta to accept the explanation without question, just as she had done. But Greta wasn't buying it. The more Karen spoke, the more Greta's suspicions grew. Karen's insistence on the necessity of the gate didn't feel genuine. It felt like someone trying to justify an action that didn't need justification. The more Karen avoided giving specifics, the more Greta wondered whether Karen was involved in something larger than just a concerned neighbor. Greta pressed further. But why didn't anyone get notified about the gate? It's right on the edge of my property, and I never saw any official notice or received a letter. I've checked. Karen's smile faltered slightly, her eyes narrowing. Well, you know how these things go, she said, her voice dropping a notch. Sometimes the process isn't as smooth as it should be. But honestly, it's not that big of a deal, Greta. It's for the greater good, you know. There it was again. The insistence that it wasn't a big deal. The minimizing of something that felt increasingly sinister. Karen was too eager to downplay the situation, as though she were trying to prevent Greta from seeing the full picture. But Greta wasn't so easily swayed. Determined to get answers, Greta decided to take matters into her own hands. She began researching the HOA, learning more about its structure and its members. What she discovered was unsettling. The HOA, which at first seemed like a simple governing body meant to uphold neighborhood standards, was anything but. It had become a powerful entity, with deep connections to local politicians, property developers, and even security firms. As she dug deeper, she uncovered evidence that the HOA had recently undergone a significant shift in leadership, and the new president, Eliza Montgomery, had pushed through several controversial initiatives that seemed to benefit a select few. The more Greta learned, the more it became clear that the installation of the gate was just the tip of the iceberg. It was part of a much larger scheme. A scheme that had been in the works for years, one that involved controlling not just the homes in the neighborhood, but the people who lived in them. The turning point came when Greta found a series of internal emails that had been leaked from the HOA's archives. The emails, sent by Eliza Montgomery herself, revealed plans to increase surveillance across the entire neighborhood, under the guise of community safety. There were mentions of installing more high-tech gates, cameras, and sensors, all designed to track movement and monitor activity. But the real shocker was the revelation that the HOA had been quietly working with a private security company, one with a controversial track record in surveillance technology. The emails indicated that the company had been contracted to test out new forms of surveillance in residential areas, using the neighborhood as a testing ground. Greta felt her stomach churn as she read through the messages. The gates were not simply about security. They were a part of a larger experiment in controlling and monitoring the residents, testing the limits of privacy and personal freedom. Greta's heart raced as the implications of what she had uncovered began to sink in. The HOA, which she had once seen as a mundane entity, was now revealed to be a shadowy organization with its own agenda, one that involved manipulating its residents for the sake of profit and control. This wasn't just about a gate, it was about something far more insidious. She had uncovered a scheme that reached deep into the fabric of the community, and she realized that she couldn't simply sit back and ignore it. The stakes were far too high, but as Greta continued to unravel the web of lies and deceit, she knew that she had to be careful. The people behind this plan were powerful, and they wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who posed a threat to their operation. She couldn't trust anyone, certainly not Karen, who was likely more involved than she let on. In the pit of her stomach, Greta knew she was entering dangerous territory. The fight for her home, her privacy, and her community had just begun, and she was no longer sure who she could trust. But one thing was clear, she couldn't stop now. The truth was out there, and Greta was determined to find it no matter the cost. Greta couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, not just by the prying eyes of her neighbors, but by the very system that governed her home. The gate, which had initially seemed like a mere inconvenience, had now grown into a symbol of something much darker. She could no longer pretend that it was just a misunderstanding or a well-meaning attempt to improve security. The gate was a tool, an instrument of control, And it was clear now that it wasn't just about her property. It was about everything. The more Greta tried to understand the full scope of the situation, the more she felt like a pawn in a game she hadn't agreed to play. As she dug deeper into the HOA's activities, she discovered that the association's seemingly benign role in the neighborhood had been slowly evolving into something far more sinister. Her first real breakthrough came when she managed to obtain some files from a local source who worked with the city's planning department. They were old files, hard copies that had been stored away, forgotten by most people who assumed they were no longer relevant. Among them were blueprints for the neighborhood, dated several years before she moved in, with detailed plans for surveillance systems, security checkpoints, and even data collection points scattered across residential properties. It was clear that the gate was part of a larger design, an integrated system to monitor residents, track movements, and control access. What had once seemed like an odd but harmless feature of suburban life now felt like the beginning of a vast and carefully constructed web of surveillance. The question was, why? Greta's next step was to visit the city council, where she hoped to find more concrete answers. She had already called several times, but her inquiries had been met with vague responses, dismissals, and promises that someone would get back to her. The fact that none of the city's representatives were eager to meet with her in person was, in itself, telling. When she finally managed to secure a meeting with one of the council members, a man named Edward Price, she found him to be evasive and guarded. His initial friendly demeanor shifted as soon as the conversation turned to the HOA and the gate. He was quick to tell her that the association had full jurisdiction over certain security measures, especially when it came to the greater good of the neighborhood. The words greater good hung in the air like a warning sign, but Greta didn't let it deter her. She pressed further, asking about the specific involvement of the HOA in security initiatives and whether there were any documents that could clarify the scope of their surveillance program. Edward's answer was non-committal at best, and when Greta asked if she could have access to the records, his response was blunt. "There are some things," he said, "that are not available to the public. I'm sure you understand the need for privacy, Ms. Harris." His refusal to provide further information only strengthened Greta's resolve. It wasn't just the gate or the surveillance cameras anymore. It was the entire system of secrecy and control that she was beginning to unravel. She realized that she was up against something much bigger than a simple neighborhood dispute. This was a well-oiled machine of manipulation, and she was now caught in its gears. After leaving the meeting, Greta was no longer content with simply asking questions. She needed to take action. She started researching Eliza Montgomery, the president of the HOA who had been the driving force behind the installation of the gate. What she uncovered was both surprising and disturbing. Eliza was no stranger to controversy, having been involved in several projects that had raised red flags in the past. Most notably, she had been a key player in the development of a private security firm that specialized in surveillance technology. This firm had been contracted by the HOA to oversee the installation of the gate and other security measures in the neighborhood. The more Greta learned about Eliza, the more she understood that the gate was just one small piece of a much larger puzzle. Eliza wasn't just trying to secure the neighborhood, she was building a surveillance network that extended far beyond the boundaries of the HOA. Greta decided it was time to confront Eliza directly. She scheduled a meeting, but when she arrived at the HOA office, she was met with a cold reception. Eliza greeted her with the same practiced smile she had seen during their earlier interactions. But there was something different this time. There was a guardedness in her eyes, a subtle but unmistakable tension in her posture. It was as if Eliza knew exactly what Greta had uncovered, and she wasn't happy about it. "I'm glad you could make it, Ms. Harris," Eliza said, her voice dripping with politeness. "What can I help you with today?" Greta wasted no time. "I've been doing some research, Eliza," she said, her tone steady but firm. "And I've come across some information that concerns me. The gate is just the beginning, isn't it? This is about more than security. It's about control, about surveillance, about tracking people's movements." Eliza's smile faltered for a split second, but she quickly regained her composure. "I'm not sure what you mean, Greta," she said, her voice now colder. "The gate is simply a precaution. We're just trying to keep the neighborhood safe." "Safe?" Greta repeated incredulously. "Safe from what? From who? I've seen the plans, Eliza. I know what's going on here. This isn't just about making people feel secure, it's about monitoring them, controlling them. You've been working with a private security company, one that specializes in surveillance technology. I know about the contracts. I know about the system you're building. There was a long silence between them, broken only by the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. Finally, Eliza spoke. You have no idea what you're talking about, Greta. This is for the safety of the community. You may not understand it now, but you will. We're simply ahead of the curve. When everything falls into place, you'll see that we were right. Greta felt a chill run down her spine. It was clear that Eliza wasn't just a participant in this scheme. She was its architect. And that made her dangerous. Greta left the meeting, her mind racing with the implications of what she had just heard. It wasn't just about a gate anymore. It was about power. It was about control. It was about using technology to shape the lives of the people who lived in the neighborhood. And now that Greta knew what was at stake, she couldn't back down. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that taking down this network wouldn't be easy. Eliza had too many allies, too much influence. The system was bigger than one person, and Greta knew that she couldn't dismantle it alone. She needed help. People who understood the technology, who could see the bigger picture. She needed allies who weren't afraid to fight back. But as Greta began to form her plan, she couldn't shake the feeling that Eliza was always one step ahead of her. It was as if the gate wasn't just a physical barrier. It was a metaphor for the invisible walls that Greta now found herself trapped behind. The stakes were higher than she had ever imagined, and the path ahead was fraught with danger. But Greta had no choice. She had already crossed a line, and there was no going back. The fight for her home, her privacy, and her freedom had just begun, and Greta was determined to see it through to the end. No matter what it took. Greta had always considered herself a problem solver, a pragmatic thinker who prided herself on her ability to piece together puzzles, whether they were architectural designs or the myriad complexities of everyday life. But as she plunged deeper into the labyrinth of deceit and manipulation she had stumbled upon, Greta began to realize that this was no ordinary puzzle. This was a war for her privacy, her autonomy, and ultimately her home. The revelations she had uncovered so far, the gate, the surveillance systems, the secretive meetings with the HOA president, were just the surface of a much larger conspiracy that stretched far beyond her neighborhood. With every new discovery, Greta felt herself sinking deeper into a rabbit hole that seemed to have no end. But the more she uncovered, the more she knew she had to fight back. After her tense meeting with Eliza Montgomery, Greta knew that confrontation alone wouldn't be enough. Eliza had too much power, too many connections, and too many ways to silence her. If Greta was going to take down this network, she needed more than just knowledge. She needed allies, people who could help her expose the truth without falling into the traps that Eliza had set so carefully. It wasn't long before she found her first ally in an unexpected place. His name was Derek Hayes, a former technology expert who had worked for the private security company that had been contracted by the HOA. Derek had left the company years ago, disgusted by the invasive nature of the surveillance technology they were developing, but he still had valuable information. Information that could help Greta take down Eliza and the entire operation. At first, Derek had been hesitant. He didn't want to get involved in something that could put him in danger again. He had seen what happened to people who tried to blow the whistle on powerful companies, and he wasn't eager to relive those experiences. But Greta's persistence and her willingness to fight for what was right eventually convinced him to come forward. Over the next few weeks, Derek shared everything he knew about the security company's operations, including the specifics of the surveillance system they had been building for the HOA. What he revealed was even more disturbing than Greta had imagined. The system wasn't just designed to monitor the neighborhood, it was designed to control it. Through a network of interconnected devices, including cameras, sensors, and even drones, the HOA had developed a system that could track every movement, every conversation, and even every transaction within the community. It was a totalitarian dream come true. A system that could not only monitor the residents, but influence their behavior in real time. But the most shocking revelation came when Derek told Greta about the software that powered the surveillance network. It wasn't just collecting data, it was analyzing it. The software was sophisticated enough to create detailed profiles of every resident, identifying patterns in their behavior and predicting their actions. It was a system that could anticipate who was likely to cause trouble, who was most likely to break the rules, and who could be manipulated into compliance. Eliza's plans were even more ambitious than Greta had originally thought. This wasn't just about keeping people safe. It was about controlling them. And it was working. The system had already been deployed in a few other neighborhoods where residents had no idea they were being watched, let alone analyzed. The more Greta learned about the system, the more she understood how far-reaching it was. It wasn't just confined to her neighborhood, it was part of a larger experiment, one that could spread to cities across the country. If Eliza succeeded in her mission, this kind of surveillance could become the norm. Greta felt a sense of urgency that she had never felt before. This was no longer just a matter of uncovering a corrupt HOA. It was a fight for the future of privacy and freedom. But as she began to piece together her plan to expose Eliza, she realized that she couldn't do it alone. She needed more than just Derek's technical expertise. She needed a strategy, a way to get the information into the hands of the people who could stop Eliza and her network. That's when she reached out to Sarah Westbrook, a local investigative journalist who had been known for exposing corruption in the city. Sarah had a reputation for taking on powerful organizations and was not afraid to go after them when she smelled a story. Greta knew that if she could convince Sarah of the gravity of the situation, she might be able to leverage the media to bring the truth to light. The meeting with Sarah was tense. Greta laid out everything she knew, from the surveillance systems to the shady dealings of the HOA. She told Sarah about Derek and the information he had provided, and about the software that could predict and manipulate behavior. Sarah listened carefully, her eyes narrowing as the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. But she was cautious. "This is big, Greta," Sarah said, her voice steady but serious. "If what you're saying is true, we're talking about a massive breach of privacy. But we're also talking about powerful people who won't go down without a fight. This could get ugly." Greta nodded. She knew the stakes were high, but she also knew that she couldn't back down now. She had already crossed the point of no return. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes," she said, her voice resolute. "We have to stop this before it gets any worse." Over the next few weeks, Greta, Derek, and Sarah worked together to gather the evidence they needed. They compiled everything. From the blueprints for the neighborhood to the internal emails from the HOA to the data Derek had on the surveillance system. They even managed to get access to some of the live footage from the cameras that were monitoring the neighborhood, revealing just how deeply the system had infiltrated people's lives. It was enough to expose the scale of Eliza's operation, but there was one problem. Eliza had covered her tracks well. The HOA had too many connections, too many allies in high places, and too many resources to take on directly. Greta knew that they couldn't just go public with the information. They needed a plan, a way to bring Eliza down without putting themselves in immediate danger. As they worked, Greta started to notice the effects of the surveillance system on her own behavior. She had always been someone who valued her privacy, who took comfort in the knowledge that her personal life was her own. But now, as the reality of the surveillance system set in, Greta began to question everything. She found herself looking over her shoulder more often, second-guessing every move she made and wondering if her actions were being watched. It wasn't just the cameras, it was the feeling of being trapped, of having no place to hide. It was the mental toll of living in a system designed to control, not protect. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this was exactly what Eliza wanted. The fear of being watched was just another form of control, a way to break people down and make them more compliant. The turning point came when Sarah received an anonymous tip. It led them to a hidden database, one that contained information on the entire surveillance program, including the names of the residents being monitored and the specific data being collected on them. It was a treasure trove of evidence that could destroy Eliza's entire operation. But Greta knew that getting their hands on it wasn't going to be easy. Eliza's people were everywhere, and they would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. The stakes had just been raised, and Greta knew that they had to act fast before Eliza caught wind of their plans. This was no longer just about fighting for her home. It was about fighting for her freedom, her privacy, and the future of her community. And as the pieces of the puzzle finally came together, Greta knew that the battle was far from over. It was just beginning. Greta sat in the dimly lit room, her fingers tracing the edges of the document spread out before her. The walls felt like they were closing in, the weight of everything that had been building for the past several weeks pressing down on her chest. She had known it wouldn't be easy, but the gravity of the situation was starting to sink in. Every step she took seemed to push her deeper into a world of corruption, surveillance, and control that she had never imagined could exist in her quiet suburban neighborhood. She had believed that the HOA's actions were a simple overreach, but now she understood that what she was up against was far worse than she had initially thought. The system Eliza Montgomery had set in motion wasn't just an isolated operation. It was a complex, far-reaching network that threatened to reshape the way people lived, not just in her neighborhood, but potentially across the country. Greta had gathered evidence, built her case, and even found powerful allies like Sarah and Derek. Together, they had compiled a dossier that would expose the full scope of Eliza's plans. They had the emails, the blueprints, the surveillance footage, the internal communications, and most importantly, the database of residents being monitored. But with every new piece of information they uncovered, the harder it became to know who could be trusted. Eliza's network was vast, stretching into every corner of local government, law enforcement, and private security. If they were going to take her down, they needed to be smarter, more careful than ever before. The moment of reckoning came when Sarah, Greta, and Derek finally sat down to discuss their next move. They had everything they needed to go public, but they knew that exposing Eliza and the surveillance network wouldn't be as simple as releasing a story. They had to think strategically, taking into account the people Eliza had in her corner, the resources she could deploy, and the lengths she would go to protect herself and her agenda. It wasn't just a matter of revealing the truth. It was about surviving the fallout. "We can't just walk into the press with all of this," Sarah said, her voice steady but filled with concern. "We're talking about exposing a network that goes deep. We've already seen how Eliza operates. She has connections in high places, and she's not going to let this slide without a fight. If we go public without a plan, we're playing right into her hands." Greta nodded, her eyes focused on the pile of evidence in front of her. She knew Sarah was right. There was no room for mistakes. "So, what do we do?" Greta asked, her voice tight with tension. "We need to get this information to the right people," Derek said, his fingers tapping the table nervously. "But we need to be careful. We don't know who we can trust. If we go too big too soon, it might give Eliza a chance to cover her tracks. We need a controlled leak, something that hits hard but doesn't give her time to react." Greta thought for a moment, her mind racing with possibilities. They could take the evidence straight to the press, but Sarah's warning about Eliza's influence weighed heavily on her. She needed to find a way to bypass the usual channels, to make sure the information got into the hands of the people who could actually do something about it. "What if we use Eliza's own tactics against her?" Greta suggested, her voice low but determined. "What if we leak the information to the people who've been monitoring us? What if we expose her own surveillance network to the residents?" Derek looked at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. "You want to turn the tables on her?" Greta nodded slowly. "We have everything we need to show the neighborhood what's been happening. We can't let Eliza control the narrative. If we go public with everything she's been doing, if we show the residents how they've been monitored, how their every move has been tracked, we can turn the whole community against her." It was a dangerous idea, one that could backfire spectacularly, but it was also the only option that seemed to give them the upper hand. If they could expose Eliza's network before she had a chance to cover her tracks, it might be enough to cripple her plans. But Greta knew that it wouldn't be easy. The HOA had its fingers in every pie, and exposing one part of the operation could send a ripple effect through the entire system. There was no guarantee that the residents would rally behind them. Some might feel violated, others might be too afraid of retaliation to speak out. It was a gamble, but it was one they had to take. They agreed to move forward with the plan, and the following days were a blur of preparation. Greta, Sarah, and Derek worked tirelessly to ensure that the evidence would be distributed in the right way. They began by creating a website that would host all the leaked documents, along with videos and photos that would show the scale of the surveillance operation. The website was designed to be anonymous, with no traceable connection to any of them. They knew that if Eliza's people discovered their involvement, there would be no telling how far she would go to silence them. As the website began to take shape, the tension in the air grew palpable. Every time Greta stepped outside, she felt like eyes were watching her. The neighborhood had begun to feel like a pressure cooker, with each passing day bringing new threats and challenges. She couldn't go anywhere without wondering if someone was tracking her, if someone was listening. Even the smallest interaction felt charged with suspicion. And yet, Greta remained resolute. She couldn't stop now, not after everything she had learned, not after everything that had been at stake. The night before the website was scheduled to go live, Greta received a call from Sarah. There was a sense of urgency in her voice that immediately put Greta on edge. "We have a problem," Sarah said. "I've been getting messages from some of the residents. Someone in the neighborhood knows what we're doing. Someone who's connected to Eliza." Greta's heart sank. She had known that there would be risks, but the idea that Eliza's people were already aware of their plans sent a chill through her. "How bad is it?" Greta asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "We don't know yet," Sarah replied, "but we need to move quickly. If Eliza finds out about this, it could be over before we even start." Greta knew the clock was ticking. They had to act fast. But as she sat there, staring at the phone in her hand, she realized that they were no longer just fighting for their own safety. They were fighting for the future of the entire neighborhood. If they didn't succeed, the system Eliza had built would remain in place, controlling the residents and tracking their every move. It wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore. It was about stopping a system of control that could spread beyond their community, beyond their city, and into the lives of countless others. The following morning, as Greta sat at her desk, preparing to hit the publish button on the website, she felt the weight of everything that had led to this moment. She had spent weeks gathering evidence, working with Sarah and Derek, building the case that would expose Eliza's network. But now, with the website ready to go live, Greta knew that there would be no turning back. Whatever happened next, she had to be ready for the consequences. The truth was out there, and it was time for the world to see it. Greta sat at her desk, her finger hovering over the mouse, the cursor blinking impatiently on the screen. The website they had created was ready to go live, and all the evidence they had meticulously gathered was about to be exposed to the world. She could feel her pulse quicken as the gravity of what she was about to do settled in. For weeks, she had been building towards this moment, pushing herself, testing her limits, and risking everything to bring the truth to light. She had gathered documents, photos, videos, and testimonies from residents who had unknowingly been part of Eliza Montgomery's surveillance network. Each piece of information was a nail in the coffin of the HOA's carefully constructed facade, and with one click, Greta would shatter that illusion. Her hand trembled slightly as she finally clicked the button, sending the website live to the world. The page loaded slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on her as the first few visitors began to trickle in. Greta took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the screen as the website's homepage displayed the damning evidence. It was all there. The plans for the surveillance system, the internal emails from Eliza herself, the footage from hidden cameras, and the database detailing the residents who had been monitored. It was a comprehensive exposé, one that would tear apart everything Eliza had worked so hard to build. Greta felt a sense of vindication. This was it. The truth was out. But just as quickly as the feeling of triumph came, it was replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. She had expected the pressure to mount, but now, with the website out in the open, it felt as if the walls were closing in. Her phone buzzed on the desk, and she snatched it up, hoping it wasn't a call from Sarah or Derek, though deep down she knew it was. The message was brief, but its implications were clear. They know. Eliza's people were already aware of the leak, and they were moving fast to cover their tracks. Greta's stomach dropped as she read the message again, her mind racing. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. She had anticipated Eliza's response, but the speed at which her adversary was mobilizing her forces took Greta by surprise. In that moment, everything she had worked for seemed to hang in the balance. Eliza was no fool. She had already anticipated the possibility of exposure, and she had built her empire with contingencies in place. Greta had underestimated the reach and power of the HOA, and now it felt as though they were everywhere, watching, waiting, ready to destroy everything she had put in motion. Her phone buzzed again, and this time the message was more urgent. Sarah and Derek are in danger. Eliza's people are closing in. Greta's heart raced, panic threatening to overwhelm her. She had been so focused on the grand picture, so sure that the evidence would be enough to take down Eliza, that she had neglected to account for the personal danger her friends were in. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just about her fight anymore, it was about the people she had dragged into it. They were just as much at risk as she was, and now Greta had to make a choice. Fight to expose the truth and risk losing everything, or pull back and protect the people she cared about. Greta made the decision in an instant. There was no going back now. She couldn't let Eliza win, couldn't let her silence the truth, but she also couldn't let her friends pay the price for her actions. She picked up the phone and dialed Sarah's number, her fingers trembling as the phone rang. The sound of the line connecting seemed to stretch on forever, and when Sarah finally picked up, her voice was strained, almost frantic. "Greta, it's happening. They're here. They're trying to shut it down." Sarah's words were sharp and urgent, but beneath the panic there was a resolve that Greta admired. "What's going on? What do we do?" Greta asked, her mind racing as she formulated a plan. "We need to move now," Sarah replied. "We've been compromised. Eliza's people are already here. They're looking for anything they can use to track us down. We don't have much time before they figure out where we are." Greta's heart raced, but her voice remained steady as she responded. "Head to the backup location. I'll meet you there. We can't let them erase everything we've done." Sarah hesitated, but only for a moment. "I'll be there. We need to make sure the evidence doesn't disappear. Eliza will do whatever it takes to bury this." Greta nodded, even though Sarah couldn't see her. "I know, we're not going to let her get away with it." Greta hung up and took a deep breath. She had a plan, but it was risky. It always had been. She had to act fast, and there was no room for hesitation. She grabbed the flash drive containing all of the backup files, everything they had worked for, and shoved it into her bag. As she moved quickly through her house, her mind ran through every possible scenario. Eliza's people would be relentless. They had the power, the resources, and the connections to do whatever it took to stop them. But Greta had something they didn't: determination. She wouldn't stop until Eliza's operation was exposed. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. Greta made her way to the backup location, her heart pounding in her chest with every step. The streets outside were eerily quiet, as if the entire city was holding its breath. The stillness felt wrong, like the calm before a storm. She arrived at the meeting spot and saw Sarah and Derek already waiting for her. They were tense, but there was a glimmer of hope in their eyes. They knew what was at stake, and they weren't backing down now. "We're running out of time," Derek said, his voice low. "Eliza's people are already moving in. We need to act fast if we're going to get the evidence out before they shut it down." Greta nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon. She could feel the weight of their decisions pressing down on her shoulders. If they failed now, everything would be lost. Eliza's network would remain intact, and the residents would continue to live under her control. There was no other option but to fight. "We go to the press," Greta said firmly. "We'll leak everything, but we need to make sure it's done right. We need to protect ourselves, and we need to make sure this story gets out before Eliza can shut it down." Sarah and Derek exchanged a glance, both of them understanding the gravity of the decision. It was risky, but it was the only way. "Let's do it," Sarah said. Greta took a deep breath. "We'll do it together." With that, they made their way to the final confrontation. Eliza's empire was about to come crashing down, and nothing was going to stop them. Not anymore. The days that followed the leak felt like a blur to Greta. What had started as a quiet, personal battle had turned into a full-scale war. She had expected resistance, but not the overwhelming force that Eliza Montgomery unleashed once the truth about the surveillance system became public. The moment their evidence hit the media, all hell broke loose. News outlets picked up the story, spreading like wildfire, and within hours, Greta's quiet neighborhood had become the center of a storm. People who had lived for years under the false sense of security provided by the HOA suddenly found themselves questioning everything. Every interaction, every moment of their lives had been monitored, cataloged, and controlled. The initial shock was profound. Neighbors who had once ignored Greta now came to her in droves, some expressing anger, others disbelief, and a few with a sense of guilt, wondering how they could have missed what was happening right under their noses. As Greta watched the chaos unfold from the safety of the backup location, she couldn't help but feel a strange mix of vindication and fear. The truth was finally out, but now there was no going back. Eliza's network was crumbling, but at the same time, the power that the HOA had wielded for so long was not easily undone. Eliza was not the type to go down quietly. As the weeks passed, Greta and her allies found themselves in a precarious position. The media storm hadn't been enough to completely dismantle the infrastructure Eliza had spent years building. And despite the public outrage, the bureaucratic and legal processes moved slowly. Eliza's lawyers fought relentlessly, trying to discredit Greta's evidence, claiming that the surveillance system had been for the benefit of the community and that the leaked information had been taken out of context. They argued that the HOA had acted in good faith, and it would take time to sort out the mess that had been created. But Greta knew that time was not on Eliza's side. As public pressure mounted, more and more residents began speaking out, telling their stories of how they had been unknowingly watched. Slowly, the truth came to light, and Eliza's ability to control the narrative started to slip away. In the midst of all this, a final blow came when a whistleblower from inside the HOA came forward. The individual, someone who had worked for the HOA for years and had seen the system from the inside, provided key evidence that connected Eliza directly to the illegal aspects of the surveillance program. This new revelation was enough to turn the tide. With this critical information, authorities were able to launch a full investigation into Eliza's operations. The legal battles were long, and there were moments when it seemed like the fight would never end. But Eliza's power was no match for the overwhelming tide of public outcry and the mounting legal pressure. Eventually, the case was taken to court, and the verdict was swift. Eliza Montgomery was found guilty of multiple counts of illegal surveillance, conspiracy, and abuse of power. The HOA was forced to disband, and its leaders, including Eliza, faced criminal charges. It was a victory that Greta could barely believe, a triumph not just for her but for the entire community. The fear that had gripped her from the moment she realized what was happening began to fade, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. In the aftermath, things began to settle. The neighborhood slowly returned to some semblance of normalcy, but Greta knew that things would never be the same. She had changed, and so had the people around her. The fight had been long, but it had given her a new sense of purpose. She had exposed the corruption that had been hiding in plain sight, and in doing so, she had given people their voices back. As she walked through the streets, now filled with residents who were no longer afraid to speak their minds, Greta felt a sense of satisfaction. She had won, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced. Eliza had underestimated the power of the truth, and in the end, it had been the truth that had set them free.